the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, to the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce our guest today, we just want to mention briefly, we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. We're offering some reading groups. Taylor's taken the ball and is leading those discussions on, I think the current one we're working on is a work by La Royal. That content has been made, that audio content is available on the Patreon as well. And we're also offering access to our Discord server there. So a few incentives for you guys to consider if you're enjoying the content we're putting out. But today we are welcoming back Henry Summers Hall, professor of philosophy at Royal Holloway University in London. We're going to be taking a look at Year Zero, Faciality from A Thousand Plateaus. And before we get started and before we formally introduce Henry or allow him to introduce himself, I just want to say my one quotable line for the episode is, "The face is a goddamned horror show." So feel free to cite that in your dissertations.
You know, it's interesting. I actually like it the way you say it, Coop, better. I think in the text it's a horror story. Is that right?
I think so. I definitely riffed on it.
But I think a horror show makes more sense because it is about seeing. Although I suppose there is an element of reading involved in terms of the substance of expression. We'll get into some of that. The face is a horror story. Is that what it is? Is that what they say?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I'll pull up the. I'll pull up the text itself and see. I'll just search horror. The face, what a horror.
What a horror. Okay. That's one of the, I think that might be at the end where they reiterate.
Oh, yeah. There's 3 references to horror. Okay. A horror story. The face is horror.
There you go.
But I'm referencing also, what is it? Real Horror Show by like the Anthony Burgess Clockwork Orange. Where they, of course, don the weird masks.
Right.
So see, I'm always working on multiple levels, you see. Multiple strata.
Multiple strata. There you go.
But anyways, we really want to just take a moment to welcome Henry back to the show. This is his 3rd appearance, and we're definitely going to link those other appearances in the show notes. And typically, as most of you know, we start out by asking our guests let's say like an introduction, their origin story rather, for philosophy. But since we've had Henry do that before, I think we'll give him the opportunity to discuss some projects or a project that he's been working on that's relevant to A Thousand Plateaus. So just a formal welcome back to the show, Henry, and please feel free to take that ball and run with it as you will.
All right, thanks, Coop. Yeah, what can I say? Well, I'm coming to the end now of a really long study of A Thousand Plateaus. So I've been working on it for a few years, and I think the deadline to give it to Edinburgh University Press is the end of August, and I should be on track to meet that. So that's really been what I've been doing recently, and I'm now at the stage where I'm writing the introductions to it. So it's quite exciting, really. I've kind of done all the hard work, and now I'm just trying to put it together and sort of synthesize it into a structure. So I've sort of split the introductions, so there's a general one, and then a metaphysical one, and a political one.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's. I've got the metaphysical one sorted, but the politics is just there's so much going on in the text.
Well, the face is a politics, right? As they say in this plateau.
Yeah.
So that's and what politics precedes being. I know they say that in the ninth plateau, right? That's another, those two little quippy lines. You could write a whole essay on those, but you intimated that you, after this deep dive, this project, you have some idea now about what A Thousand Plateaus is or is about. Do you want to tell us a little bit of that before we dive into this particular plateau?
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I should do really after making that claim, shouldn't I? Yeah, I mean, I think the central project, the way I'm reading it, is that it's organized around this distinction between two different ways of understanding organization. Still, I mean, they say really clearly that politics is about how we understand organization, and I think the faciality plateau is where this comes through really clearly. But I think the question really is about, you look at the world around you and it's got things that seem relatively stable and things that are changing. And traditionally, we've pushed back, the question about how that world's organized to see a kind of static structure that's then expressed in time. And obviously in Difference and Repetition, they call that the sedentary distribution. And the alternative is the nomadic distribution, which sees the sort of the relatively stable features of our world as being expressions of a kind of field of intensity or a field of becoming. And so the question really is, how do you explain this kind of emergence of form in the world without presupposing form? So Platonism and sedentary distributions and traditional ways of doing philosophy tend to see, the origin of the form we find around us in a kind of an atemporal realm where that form pre-exists. And you find it in Kant too, where, what kind of makes it possible for us to relate to the world of objects? Well, in a sense, we've always already organized the world in those categories before we begin. So I think that's the question, is, how does form arise, from a non-formed field? And the political really comes out of that, because the question of form, if you presuppose form as that which kind of gives order to the world around us, then you end up in positions whereby you see social organization, for instance, as one where there are roles presupposed, which people fit into, where the structures are presupposed, and then people kind of communicate according to those structural relations that pre-exist them. And so you end up with notions of hierarchy, and you end up with a kind of falsification of our relation to the world. So that kind of quite metaphysical, quite Bergsonian question about how we understand, or Nietzschean as well, being on the basis of becoming, I think opens out onto this question of how can we think a politics or a notion of organization, social organization, that doesn't presuppose structure to begin with. So Pierre Clastres is really important there, because Pierre Clastres, for instance, he takes quote unquote archaic people where there's supposed to be an absence of power because they don't have hierarchical structures. And he shows that they do have structure, but it's just not the structure you find in a sedentary distribution. So Deleuze and Guattari, I think, are trying to sort of cash out that in a much broader way. So if we move away from seeing the world in terms of form, how can we still have a notion of social organization? And how does that notion of social organization lead to something more positive than what you might find in a more Platonic model of society, or I guess a Hegelian model in many ways? So I think that's what I think's going on very loosely. But obviously the book's really, really long. So there's lots and lots of other stuff going on throughout. And, in many ways, cashing out those insights just takes them a lot of work. So, and it's taken me a lot of work to figure out what they're doing, or at least to come up with a hypothesis sometimes of what they might be doing at various points. So that's what I've been doing, and I'm almost done with it.
No, this is good, because we've seen in these previous plateaus leading up to the seventh plateau on faciality, the instead of form, they lay out this notion of strata, right? And so we've gotten in plateau 3, which is obviously somewhat difficult and has to be revisited for a lot of this. We get the notion of the different types of stratification, the different strata, and we also see in the previous plateau, which Coop and I have skipped and we'll come back to, but we get a lot about the question of the organism, right? The organic stratum, And now we're sort of seeing how the face becomes the substance of expression for the signifying regime of signs, or at least the mixed signifying and subjective passional regimes, and becomes a sort of homogeneous substance of expression, replacing the heterogeneous ones from the pre-signifying, for example, which is what they focus on at least. And so now we are kind of getting more into this. I guess what one of the payoffs is conjoining this. For example, I think plateaus conjoining together, is always a good way of sort of reading across the text, like, sort of connecting the rhizome up, if you will. And so like the payoff from, there's a lot of dividends being paid off from the fourth plateau on the postulates of linguistics in this chapter. It's not as explicit, but there's still this ongoing critique of linguistics and its focus on semiology as a language specific or language centric type of model, and I think that's one of the interesting things is the politics from Plateau 4 and Plateau 6 are kind of joining together in this continuing investigation, and obviously from the fifth plateau, right on the different regimes of signs. So there's a nice kind of movement from 3, 4, 5, 6 to 7 that builds, right? They're slowly building and interlocking these different critiques, which I think is part of because you gave a metaphysical exposition. You said you had the 3 introductions, the general, the metaphysical, and I think that it is. I think with Deleuze and Guattari, a lot of times it is difficult, especially with the onslaught of concept creation, not just in this book, but others. It's hard to separate the metaphysical interventions from the political, right? They do seem intertwined. Maybe you can, as they always say, right? Perhaps they are pure in a de jure manner, but they seem to be always mixed. There's always a mixture, which is precisely, I think, exemplified in something like Critique of Images of Thought. From Difference of Repetition, right? That's a metaphysical undertaking, but it has political implications that are inevitably intertwined.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you go back to 5, we're looking at faciality, but the face comes in Plateau 5, right?
That's right.
And it comes in between the pre-signifying and the signifying, and it does 2 things. Like on the one hand, it's a metaphysical claim that, you have this kind of really messy polyvocal form of communication in the pre-signifying where, people communicate with gestures and movement and words, and all of these things are going on at the same time. And like if you think about gestures, going back to Bergson, a gesture can't be decomposed in the way a sentence can be decomposed into phonemes, right? Gestures aren't made up of atomic elements stuck together in the same way that words are. So the pre-signifying has that kind of structure, and then the face is what kind of allows us to move to a much more kind of predicative model of organization. But on the other hand, as you're saying, this is all tied into politics, where if you think about the pre-signifying, it's where people act in terms of free action, and there's no surplus labor. There's no surplus labor because there's no such thing as labor. And in order for there to be a surplus labor to make the state structures possible, you need to be able to separate actions from actors from agents. And that requires, once again, moving from a model where all of these things are mixed up together in a polyvocal form of communication to something where, like an action is like a universal that an agent can do or not do. And so in that case, you can start stockpiling the results of those actions in a way where in the pre-signifying regime, everything interpenetrates. And so there isn't a way of separating off work from the worker in the way that you would need to do to create a surplus. So those 2 moments go together. You have this kind of move to a kind of signifying regime, but you also have the move to a notion of labor that allows us to stockpile stuff that makes state structures possible. So the metaphysical and the political just like run all the way through, kind of like a kind of double helix throughout these sections. It's really fascinating, I think.
Now, you brought up Plateau 5, and Coop and I discussed that fairly recently, perhaps in the past month and a half. And one of the things, you're right, they bring up the concept of faciality. I know that they say things like, in the signifying regime, in the despotic, which they identify with the despotic regime of signs, the priest administers the face of God. The despot God has never hidden his face. He makes himself one or several. The master does not hide the face. It is the face. And they say lies and deception may be a fundamental part of the signifying regime, but secrecy is not. And then conversely, when the face is effaced, when the faciality traits disappear, we can be sure that we have entered another regime, other zones infinitely muter and more imperceptible, where subterranean becomings animal occur, becomings molecular, nocturnal deterritorializations, overspilling the limits of the signifying system. So I think that it's interesting that they've already kind of given us some, they've already, and then of course you have the diagrams with like the double turning away of the face, which I think is, related to maybe the passional. Yeah. In any case, it is good to, as you're reading these plateaus, it is sometimes good to sort of keep sifting back and forward, right? And because there is an overspilling of the conceptual, right? Not all, even like, for example, like not all of the elements of the rhizome are in the first plateau. They're scattered. The critique of psychoanalysis in Plateau 2 gets taken up here and there and elsewhere, right? And so it is good to sometimes be sort of replaying some of the plateaus in order to fit together some of the pieces. It's so that does make the reading a little bit more, I suppose, again, multi-layered and not necessarily a temporally linear read, which is why I think the first read through is sometimes maybe a little bit disjointed feeling and overwhelming, and perhaps a bit bemusing.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's not just going back. You also go forwards here in some ways, because those two regimes, when you've got the face of Christ, they talk about the two models, one of which is the kind of the head-on face, where if you look at what Paris, I can't remember what his first name is, but the source they introduce here, Jean Paris, when he gives these two models of the face that he talks about, the face of Christ, you have the one model who is head on, which is kind of tied to the signifying regime, and then you have the post signifying regime where you have the figures kind of facing each other. But at the same time, you also have, in that head on figure of Christ, he talks about it as being a transcendent Christ, and then the one that I think is at the start of the faciality plateau, which is tied to the post signifying regime, is so the image right at the start, he talks about it as being one where Christ is kind of in the world. You can see the fishing nets and the boats if you look at the image there right at the beginning of the plateau, and you can also arrange these in terms of the kind of the state form of sedentary distributions, and then the axiomatic that comes later, and the way in which in the kind of despotic state you have a kind of transcendent control, and then that becomes a kind of immanent control within an axiomatics. So there is, as well as going back, I think this plateau also draws you forwards and, makes these connections with stuff that goes on right in sort of plateaus 12 and 13, and the different ways in which state structures or sedentary structures can, kind of impose form on us. All of those ways are present in faciality already. So in many ways, it kind of balances the whole text, this plateau, as many of them do, if that makes sense.
Well, I mentioned Plateau 12, and I mean, one of the ways that they describe the white wall black hole system, the sort of abstract machine of faciality, is in terms of capture, right? I'm trying to see where I found this. Where exactly is it? It's because you have the central eye, right, which would be the black hole, capturing everything that would exceed or transform either the assigned affects or the dominant significations. So at least one element, the black hole element, is that gravitational element has an element of capture that we'll see. Sorry, not in Plateau 12, but in Plateau 13, right? 7,000 BC. So here, that again, as you mentioned already, is why they say the faces of politics, right? And I know Guattari will say this just as explicitly as they say it here in this chapter. In chapter 4 of Machine Unconscious on faciality, Guattari goes deeper into this notion that only certain systems of power, right? Only certain power formations need faces, and so in the Machine of Unconscious, he goes deeper into this, not just in for example, the biunivocalization and binarization of the subjective choices that faces offer. Seeing a face immediately has to, or is supposed to, respond or correspond to answering the questions of X or Y, right? Which is the most general way of doing it. But man or woman, young, old, black, white, etc. And these redound into a kind of matrix, which is I think, also a part and parcel of the notion of capture. There's a capture of sort of solidifying, concretizing subjects caught within the sort of interplay of faces and faciality traits. And he does the same thing for refrains, right? He looks at how refrains under capitalism evolve into a certain way. And so faces under capitalism are, about sort of serving this dominant matrix of sort of corresponding to the accepted deviances from the norm, which is why I think, and we can get to this in a second, I've already said a lot, but which is why I think we should look at some of the passages in this plateau on racism, which I think is quite an interesting conceptual development.
Yeah, and I think the notion of an ideal, if you go back to wherever you want to go back to, all the way through really, then what defines sort of sedentary distributions is this notion of you set up an ideal and then you measure things by their distance from it. Mm-hmm. So if you think about the notion of Cuvier's account of what a species is like, here's the ideal form of a particular creature, and then we'll see that particular instantiations, okay, so they're different from it, but they're different from it because they're degenerate in some way. Mm-hmm. We're kind of pushed away from this ideal. And if you compare that to, say, Simpson, so the model of evolutionary theory that Deleuze and Guattari take up in Plateau 3, you have instead the idea that a species is like a field of variation, mm-hmm. where there are all sorts of different forms, and genes are expressed in complex ways through interactions. That means that the species doesn't have a single ideal, but has a kind of field of variation where there's no central point to it. So the notion of an ideal, once again, I think just really reiterates the centrality to facialized power structures of this notion of a sedentary distribution, where you have a fixed model, like the model of the white male Christ, kind of there at the beginning, and then particular creatures are kind of seen as at very different distances from that. Children, women, people who aren't white, they're all kind of at a distance and determined by that distance. So, but I mean, on the racism thing, I think the one thing that's quite interesting is that if you're not white, you're not the other, as you would be in, say, Fanon. If you're not white under the faciality, you're like a degenerate form of, the Christ ideal. you're kind of in the same system but further away from the ideal. Whereas for someone like Fanon or de Beauvoir, for de Beauvoir, if you're a woman, then you're seen as other. So there's something quite interesting going on there too, in the background in their account of racism and sexism. That's interesting, I think.
I think what's also interesting is their claim, this jump from, let's say, the bodies, the polyvocality of pre-signifying the organic stratum that's kind of with the face sort of like subjugates and bootstraps itself on top of that and subjugates the organic to the signifying and the subjective strata, right? There's this way in which that's part of how it becomes this homogeneous substance of expression. And I think that what's interesting is for their way of looking at racism, this is specifically page 178, it's the same way in which they are thinking about the black holes and the white wall black hole system as functioning by capture, where nothing is supposed to be excluded or external to the system. Everything is brought in, and that's why they say European racism never operates by exclusion. It operates by determination of degrees of deviance in relation to the white man face, which endeavors to integrate non-conforming traits into increasingly eccentric and backward waves, sometimes tolerating them at given places under given conditions in a given ghetto, sometimes erasing them from the wall, which never abides alterity. But the line that always I recall is at the end of that paragraph where racism never detects the particles of the other. It propagates waves of sameness until those who resist identification have been wiped out, or those who only allow themselves to be identified at a given degree of divergence. Its cruelty is equaled only by its incompetence and naivete. I like this image of racism propagating waves of sameness. And it goes back to that thing that I was saying about the binarization of how faces correspond to these choices, where there's within at certain times, certain places, there are accepted degrees of divergence from that center, which is very much like the center of the signifying semiotic, with the face of God, with the face of Christ here, right?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think what's really key, as you say, is that everything. I mean, these are like gridded somewhere. Everything is kind of put onto the grid. In some place. And I think what's kind of, like I say, going on in the background is really this movement from a kind of nomadic distribution to a sedentary distribution. And one of the aspects of that is this idea that everything can be described within the system of the signifying regime or the post-signifying regime. So everything has to have its place within that system. And I think, so that's really key to their account of racism, is that, racism is a distribution within a signifying regime of signs. But once again, it comes back to this notion of the idea that it's by separating things out and understanding them in terms of kind of like qualities that can be separated off from agents, et cetera, that we have this notion of labor, whereby there can be a surplus, as opposed to the free action of the polyvocal or pre-signifying regime. So one thing faciality does is it makes sure everything can be understood in terms of a kind of predicative model, where everything can be given a value and quantified and separated off so that it can be accumulated, or et cetera. And in a sense, it's really important that everything's in the system, because otherwise you open up this notion that there's like another form of organization whereby something different is going on. So there has to be this kind of universalization to, in a sense, show that this is the only way. This is the transcendental illusion, right? That it's the only way that we can organize things is in terms of the binarization of faciality. We understand everything as if it was determined in terms of predication and representation. And if that failed, if we put something outside of that, then we open up the possibility of another mode of organization. And that's really, the worry that, or the drive of faciality for me is to exclude the possibility of like another way of organization being possible. So it's a closing off of a nomadic distribution.
Do you think that is why they define the face as redundancy, right? It's like the substantification of the redundancies of the signifier. That's part of the white wall of the face, right? It's merely sort of redundancy made flesh, or not even flesh, but like incorporeal flesh, if you want to even call it that. That's partly why nothing is external to it. If everything is sort of redundant with everything else, the sign, in terms of the way they look at signifiers, it seems like the face is that ping ponging, right, of two faces. It kind of like in the Caesarean diagram of the emitter receiver, if you know what I'm talking about, where like, or just they bring up Lacan and Sartre, but I was thinking about how Lacan has the whole notion about misrecognition, right? So like we receive our message from the other, inverted, right, in this kind of way, and so I feel like that it's only perhaps by breaking through the wall that towards the end, when they suggest these becomings imperceptible and animal and molecular with the probe head, that we can, I don't want to say get out of redundancy, but perhaps maybe put it in its place to where it's not the overriding, I don't want to say enemy, but the overriding force at play.
Yeah, I think all the way through reading it back again, right after the racism thing, I really haven't taken much notice of this paragraph where, they talk about, they talk about, obviously, painters paint this kind of ideal of Christ, and that's really important. But then they kind of point out that, painters just do all sorts of kind of like weird versions of Christ that sort of fail to kind of tie in with that ideal. So there's already a kind of counter-signifying regime of signs in the art that's supposed to ground the ideal of Christ as the model of faciality. They sort of say the Christ athlete at the fair, the Christ mannerist queer, Christ Negro, or at least a black virgin at the edge of the wall. So you have this kind of counter signifying going on right from the beginning, where the ideal is contested and in a sense just sort of broken apart. And yeah, you're right. We can talk about that stuff. The Chrétien de Troyes stuff, I think, is really relevant here, but maybe we can get to that a bit later, in terms of counter-signifying. I would say the model I've sort of taken in my book for looking at faciality, which ties in with this kind of atmospherization, is actually Kant and the notion of a transcendental ideal. So in the transcendental dialectic, Kant has this question, and the question is, how is it that we can kind of ask questions of the world? You can say, is this glass transparent? Is this table solid? You can ask questions of the world, and you'll always get an answer. You ask it what the quality of something is, and you'll always get like a yes/no response to whether something has a particular property or not. So that's a requirement for science. And Kant argues that in order to make that possible, that move possible, that whenever we ask whether something has a quality, we'll get an answer yes or no. There won't be some sort of intermediate answer. We need like a model of an ideal that has all of the qualities, and we kind of have this ideal and we refer particular things to this ideal, this kind of ideal of a kind of total being that has every possible quality. And having that ideal kind of, in a sense, gives us the guarantee that when we ask questions of things in the world, for any given predicate we ask about, there'll be a yes/no answer from things in the world. Now, for Kant, that's where the idea of God comes from. God's the idea of an absolutely determined being that then lets us kind of judge sort of lesser beings and lets us make the assumption that anything we encounter in the world, for any predicate, it will or will not have that predicate. And I think faciality is really similar here. The thing that Deleuze and Guattari are trying to set out is how, a signifying regime of signs guarantees that when we ask any questions about qualities things have, there'll always be an answer in terms of a kind of discrete determinate, as they say, a ready-made signifying message. So everything will always already have a sign associated with it. And so we don't need to move into some kind of nomadic account that will give us an account of the generation of properties or the generation of predicates from some field of becoming. So I think Kant's doing a lot of the work here in the background with the notion of a transcendental ideal. And I think the figure of Christ in many ways is their kind of more political version of that Kantian metaphysics. So I think I sort of went off on a bit of a rant there, but I think so. But I think that kind of ties in with this notion. They call it the atmospherization of signs elsewhere. I think so everything can be understood as signifying, and faciality is what guarantees that anything we encounter in the world will have a signifying sign associated by giving us an ideal.
See, I'm glad you brought this up, because when I was rereading this, I had the thought that they are undertaking a transcendental explanation with faciality. For example, not just with faces, right? When they say concrete faces cannot be assumed to be ready-made, they're not universals. There's an abstract machine of faciality. Don't expect it to resemble what it produces, right? So the abstract machine of faciality is the conditional possibility for faces, right? Doesn't resemble the faces. That's a typical Deleuzian move, right? Because we're not supposed to do the thing that Kant at times did, like in the when he in the Critique of Pure Reason, when he's in Deleuze's account at least, sort of doing a kind of psychological tracing, and relying on a kind of resemblance. The other transcendental argument is that for them, it seems as though, and this is most clearly on page 181, where they say the order is different, right? It's not that the face assumes a prior signifier or subject. The order is different. Despotic and authoritarian concrete assemblage of power, triggering of the abstract machine of faciality, the white wall black hole, installation of the new semiotic of signifiance and subjectification on that holy surface. So, like, the reason why I think that there's an interest, and I think it's on the same page, where they seem to really try to nail down this idea that signifiers in the redounding amongst the chains would be swept away without this homogeneous substance of expression of faciality, or that the anchoring of the black holes from which subjectification proceeds also needs this abstract machine in order to secure a kind of its own its functioning. So not only are faces sort of trying to be accounted for transcendentally, and they are generated, they are not universals existing for all times and places, but also the regimes of the signifying and post-signifying regimes get their anchoring, their conditions of possibility from the abstract machine of faciality. So that was the two main places, and there are probably more in this plateau, but those were the two main places where I was seeing this reliance on a transcendental argument, and I was wondering if that sort of makes sense from your reading.
Yeah, and I think that's right. We've talked a bit about this move from, here it's from the head to the face, and it's from the polyvocal to the signifying. If you go back to Bergson, Bergson kind of talks about the way thought works in very similar ways to the polyvocal, right? You've got this kind of interpenetrative multiplicity, all these things going on at the same time. They can't be separated out, and they kind of have their own inherent unity to them. Now, what happens when you do what the faciality machine wants to do, which is to make these different moments discrete and separable, so you can kind of accumulate the surpluses? What happens when you make them separable is they lose that inherent unity, and you need something else to combine them together. And Bergson says, it's like beads on a necklace. You've got as soon as they become discrete, our thoughts, you need like the thread of the necklace to hold all of these different elements together. You need this kind of extra moment, because otherwise they just sort of scatter everywhere. And so once you've made these elements discrete, you need an extra element to hold them together. And I think that's what the white wall is, really. once you've got these kind of separate signifying moments, in order to hold them together, you need, like, in a sense, a homogeneous space to go back to the really Bergsonian claims within which to hold them. And I think that's the kind of transcendental argument that's being made here. But the second argument is a transcendental illusion then, which is that we take all organization as being, in terms of kind of discrete elements within a homogeneous field, Kant's claim. And, that makes possible a certain way of understanding the world. But it's a transcendental illusion because, if you want to have a hierarchical model of power, then Deleuze and Guattari will argue, you need to have this kind of model of what organization is. But of course, there are other ways of understanding organization that don't require these kind of hierarchical models of power, such as we find in archaic societies or in various other collectives that they look at later on in A Thousand Plateaus. So there's a sense in which, the transcendental illusion whereby, Pierre Clastres says, it's very difficult to understand how primitive societies can be organized, but not in terms of coercive power, is put in place by faciality, because faciality gives us this notion that all organization is discrete elements on a white wall. So once you've got the notion that thinking and meaning is understood in terms of discrete predicates, essentially on the white wall rather than polyvocal structures, it's very difficult to think other modes of organization, and it's very difficult to think other ways in which power could operate within a society.
Would you argue that, since this seems to be one of your central theses, both metaphysical and political, is this precisely why the book begins with the rhizome and laying out what a rhizome does and how it organizes differently than types of hierarchies we see in trees or even root radical systems, right? I know that one of the things that they look at is what the army without a general, right? Which you can kind of somewhat analogously relate to the chief in Clastres' examinations, right? Where the chief, himself does not have the power to order. Really, he's able to use his words and his charisma to try to keeps, like, let's say, feuds or enmity from overboiling, but he doesn't have the kind of power to order like we might expect from other leaders, like the despot. So I guess that my question was, is this why they start with the rhizome? They lay that out first because of the question of a different type of organizational principle.
I've got a quote. I just found it in a paper, but I looked. I can't. The footnote to the paper just says "IBID." It's like the first footnote in the paper, so I think it's from Dialogues, but it could be completely off. But the quote is: Deleuze says, "The question has always been organizational, not at all ideological. Is an organization possible that is not modeled on the apparatus of the state, or even to prefigure the state to come?" And I think, that's absolutely, you're absolutely right. That's why the question of organization, is right there at the beginning. And, when they talk about, you've got Rosenthal and Petitot, and, they're doing this stuff about arborescent structures, and they're talking about how the simplest homeostatic model of a state is military organization, where you have a hierarchy and everything's given. All the roles are given in advance, and the modes of communication are given in advance. And that gives you a stable society, but at the price that people are defined by the role they happen to take up, and the relations they have with others are all defined in advance by the hierarchy of the military structure. And so, the rhizome is a way of saying, well, what would it look like to have relations defined, had relations not defined rather, but to have relations kind of naturally evolve and these connections kind of emerge through encounter, rather than these relations being defined by a kind of pre-existing organizational structure. So how could that work? And so the rhizome and the arborescent structure, I think, are absolutely at the core of the political discussion, and that's really the question. I think that's the radical thing I think about A Thousand Plateaus, is that the question of politics is tied to the question of organization so strongly.
They have that line on 175 This is an affair not of ideology, but of economy and the organization of power.
Whoa.
So, I mean, that gets to the heart of sort of, that's just a kind of a quick way of summing up some of the arguments you've been making about what you sort of learned the books about. That's a nice little nugget.
Yeah, it's really good. I'm gonna put a little star by that.
Yeah, that's what I do as well. I try to put a little asterisk there.
I can't help but think of like Bataille and like acephaly or acephala or whatever, however you pronounce it. And just the image of the headless, you know what I mean? Just that image that you always see with the missing head and the disemboweled, like the viscera. And I suppose maybe that's relationship to the body without organs and faciality. I don't know, just something to consider. Mm-hmm. But that image I don't know. That's what when you guys were talking about, I don't know, the army without a leader model or something like that.
Yeah.
That's the image that conjured for me. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that kind of absence of the face. But obviously they do accept that we have faces. No, absolutely. I think that's right. And I think Foucault's really big here too. I think there's lots of Foucault going on in here about if you think about history of sexuality, for instance, that notion of the categories that we use to determine ourselves are, produced by relations of force that differ in kind from them. And that self-description itself is a form of oppression because it happens in terms of systems generated through power. So I think that the Bataille is clearly relevant here. And I think that Foucault is also a really big figure in this section. Yeah.
I was thinking about this Coop has texted me earlier about how the face is a horror show, and it made me think about like in the horror film genre, the slasher film, right? I mean, all of the greatest, most memorable like slasher film villains, from Jason Voorhees with the old school hockey goalie mask, which is like perfect white wall black holes, right? The Michael Myers mask, right? The sort of washed out mask of, who is it again, Coop? Who played Captain Kirk?
Yeah.
It's
God.
William Shatner. Yeah, the William Shatner mask. Leatherface from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I mean, even
Scream, the ghost. I forget what the actual name of the mask is, but yeah.
Yeah, the Scream mask is a great example. Even Freddy Krueger, there's a kind of the severe burning that his face and body, he does. All you have is the flesh beneath, and not the skin that would normally compose a face. So there's a kind of there that is a different way of revealing what's underneath, if you will. And I was just thinking about how it's so central, it's so iconic to those films that a villain without that would be somewhat, if not evolving the genre, moving somewhat beyond it or mixing it with something else.
But do you think they're directly referencing that stuff? I'm just thinking, because this is 1980, right? So
they wouldn't have had it, because like even Friday the 13th came out 78, 79. So and it'd be, I doubt that they would. Deleuze is a little too highbrow for those films. He's a cinephile. But no, you're right. I mean, but the arc of the slasher film becoming popularized is right around this time, right? That 1980 is sort of right at the inception of this form of film becoming popular, at least in the States, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's a little bit late for it to be referenced, but I think the horror story thing. He must have had some. I mean, there's Eyes Without a Face, right? Is French 60s? Right?
Yeah, look that up, because I'm not familiar with the.
But it'd be interesting to know. I mean, as with so much of this, it'd be interesting to know, like what was in his head when he wrote that. When they wrote that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Big horror story, because there must have been something there, where he was whether Deleuze or Guattari was kind of. I mean, obviously there's a reference in Sketch for the Theory of the Emotions by Sartre. He talks about the face as as a face and kind of that's seen, I think, coming through the window. There's a kind of horror story motif there.
Okay.
And I think that's one that Deleuze picks up elsewhere, and is quite different from the other face that comes in here, which is the look that Deleuze and Guattari kind of want to move away from. That
Right.
Sartrean look. So there is this other moment of the kind of the horror of the face in Sketch of the Theory of the Emotions that it could be a reference to. But I like to think that it's prefiguring some of these great American slasher movies. I think that's
And Guattari himself at times focuses, or at least alludes to, the interesting role of Freud's face in analysis, even if ideally during the session the analyst is seated behind the recumbent analysand. In one of the diagrams of Machine Unconscious, it's a diagram of little Hans's rhizome, as Guattari names it, and Freud's kind of paternalistic faciality traits plays a role. Coop, you might be able to pull that up. I know you like some of the diagrams from that, but again, it is interesting, right? For Freud, Freud himself is interested in how the decision not to the worry about not only the analysand reacting to the analyst's face, right, in the session and swaying their free association, but also the analyst sort of worried, I suppose, in the whole Hall of Mirrors game of transference, worried about keeping that evenly suspended attention. And so even Freud is a bit, underneath the surface at least, very much aware of the face's means of contaminating the whole procedure of the talking cure.
And I think that's on quite a slightly different territory, but I think one of the things about the state is that the state on the one hand presupposes faciality. It presupposes this idea that all power operates in terms of coercive power that we find through that particular model of organization. But on the other, the state, the faciality is an abstract machine. So in order to operate, the state itself is an assemblage, and it has its roots in an intensive structure, singularities. So even though the state sees its origins as being in a pre-existing atemporal structure, that's the transcendental illusion, it itself is generated from intensive processes that quite often, operate to subdue people who are kind of developing other modes of organization, for instance, and there are all these kind of other power structures going on. So there's that similar ambivalence there. The state requires a certain model of organization to function, but in order to put that model of organization into play, it kind of relies on intensive processes that fall outside of it to make it possible. So it forgets its own origins. And I guess there might be a similar move that one could say is there in Freud, right? That perhaps in some level, and I don't know enough about psychoanalysis, but there might be a movement where what makes Freudian psychoanalysis possible is a kind of forgotten origin in the same way, maybe.
No. I mean, I do think that not all sessions are not all analysts practice, right, that old school Freudian method. And obviously Guattari was more interested in group sessions as well, right? Not more, but he at least practiced group sessions, and one can imagine a kind of seminar format, right? Seated around one's peers. There's also this other thing about faces that I know at the very last page of the book, or the book of this plateau, I was recalling, and Coop, I can't remember who we discussed this with or who brought it up a couple months back, but there's this scene that Rousseau tells several times about basically the birth of consciousness and self-consciousness, where everyone's seated around the fire or around the fountain, everyone's singing and dancing and having fun, and there's this like split moment where inequality immediately emerges sui generis into the world, where there's a gaze, a sort of split second moment where one notices that someone is singing better, someone is dancing better, someone is more beautiful, et cetera. And it all happens by means of the eyes and the face. I'd have to pull that up, and I know that's just sort of maybe off topic, but I think that it, as a, well, let's call it a myth, if you will, the mythological origin of consciousness, the fact that, and the mythological origin of inequality, the fact that it goes by way of also, if you will, the spontaneous birth of the face as the outlet of subjectification and consciousness, the mirror or the wall bouncing back the information of the inequality of one's abilities. Like it seems to be also a mythological origin story of faciality, if only secondarily to Rousseau's intent, right? If that makes sense. So
yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think the one difference here, one of the key differences would be that I think for Deleuze and Guattari, it's not like you look at kind of quote unquote primitive societies and there's no power structures or anything, because that would be like no one's sitting around a fire and we're going, hey guys, like look at us, just we're all the same. That happens a little bit actually, but what happens in a way is that you have like loads of power structures in primitive societies, but they're not organized around an ideal. So what happens with the face is it's a way of, kind of like, it's like a prism, right? It's like a reverse prism, which is just a prism. But, you put all the different colors in and you get the white light coming out the other side. And I think they talk about primitive societies as having, you're a member of a clan, but you're also a family, and there are certain religious rites that you're engaged in that other people in the clan won't be. And, there are other structures at play. So that there are different powers, but they're all incommensurate and they all kind of like exist and they're fragmentary. And, you can kind of almost like, swing between them. Whereas what the face does is it just kind of like coalesces them all onto the same plane. And that's, so it's not that there's not inequality, but, well, maybe it is that there is inequality, but what differences become commensurate with the face. Whereas prior to that, you've got like a whole sequence of structures that people are operating in, and there isn't like a central unity, but the face is a central unity. The face of Christ is like, this is it. And, we can deviate from it in different ways, but there's that one homogeneous point. So it's not a movement from everyone sitting around in the circle to suddenly like, this guy's like a much better singer than me, let's make him chief. It's like there are all these different structures, and then suddenly the face kind of like brings them all together and like lays them on top of each other in concentric circles. They say, they use that metaphor, right? It's just as many power structures, but they're organized in concentric circles by the face.
Right. Yeah, I like that. And now this may be off topic. Oh, look, Coop, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I had an idea or a notion that I thought kind of connected to some things that Henry has discussed about the formation of the state. I was thinking about sovereigns having their faces on coinage, right? Because that sort of it kind of presents the the transcendental illusion respective to like surplus in a way, right? Because it deterritorializes the notion that the surplus is coming from labor, and it reverses it in the sense that like the sovereign or what have you is the one who's developed, like they're creating value in right. So it's kind of like the reverse prism idea in a way. It's like this through the sovereign, like it kind of, it obscures the whole, I suppose, I don't know, the theft aspect as far as surplus is concerned from labor and whatnot. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And particularly of interest too, I think, on American currency, somewhere I want to say it's like the 40s or 50s, they actually added "In God We Trust," which I think furthers that sort of connection between capitalism and this whole and faciality or what have you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, like money's, the ultimate homogeneous good, right? You kind of said it, and I think that's absolutely right. That you introduce homogeneity, and then you kind of you kind of go, right. So I think in they talk about how the Greek city state became organized by taking all the hearths. Everyone had like a little hearth that they would cook at and like a shrine in their own little houses, and so it was all very fragmentary. And they put the shrine and the hearth in the center of the city-state, and suddenly everything was on the same homogeneous plane, and that was the kind of the beginning, these state structures. So I think absolutely, the face on coins, is for them would be like a really archetypal moment where you introduce this homogeneity that precisely is tied to that movement from free action, where things can't be separated off, to the possibility of discrete labor and hence surplus labor. Yeah, and it's that organizational move that's key. And you're right, it's a theft and it's an illusion, a deception. As I think Taylor was saying about how they describe it in the signifying regime, right? There's a deception there, and the deception is that everything is signified and relates back to the despot as the ground for those signifiers. Yeah, absolutely.
One thing that popped up for me early in the plateau, they use the word spiritual twice in a non-pejorative sense. So on 171, they say the inhuman in human beings, that is what the face is from the start. To the point that if human beings have a destiny, it is rather to escape the face, to dismantle the face and facializations, to become imperceptible, to become clandestine, not by returning to animality, nor even by returning to the head, but by quite spiritual and special becomings animal, by strange becomings that get past the wall and get out of the black holes that make faciality traits themselves finally elude the organization of the face. And then a few pages later, 176, they say, and they're talking about the pre-signifying regime. They mentioned animal spirits, jaguar spirit, bird spirit, ocelot spirit, toucan spirit, and they go on to say, shaman, warrior, and hunter organization of power, fragile and precarious, are all the more spiritual by virtue of the fact that they operate through corporeality, animality, and vegetality. I only bring this up because I thought it was interesting that not only in the pre-signifying, and at the end of the plateau, they make it clear it's not about some sort of return, right? It's not about some sort of nostalgia for the pre-signifying. We're always going to fail at playing at being primitives, quote unquote, right? That kind of yearning and nostalgia is maybe not by their definition, but I do think more or less overwhelmingly sort of fascistic, right? And going to just enmesh us into more into these strata, then get out of them, break down the white wall and get out of the black hole. But the spiritual is not just associated with the pre-signifying regimes of the shaman, warrior, and hunter organization of power, but it's also associated with the destiny, right? The destiny of human beings to escape the face. So not by returning, as they said, not by returning to animality or to the head, right, which would be the pre-signifying, as we said, but by quite spiritual and special becomings animal, by strange true becomings that get past the wall and get out of the black hole. So I do think it's interesting this, and maybe I'm being too sensitive to this word of the spiritual. You've been bringing up Henry Bergson, and as you know, Deleuze, when he says the word spirit in his early work, and even now, and in 1980 with Guattari, my ears always perk up. I know it's the adjective here, but he tends to opt for Bergson's virtual and slowly replace the notion of spirit, though it never fully goes away. It just gets downplayed from his Bergsonian type of vocabulary that he borrows. But I do think it's interesting that the probe head that they bring up at the end of the plateau, right, breaking out of the wall, or breaking through the wall and getting out of the black hole, that nevertheless there's something spiritual about it. And I thought that was something that I don't have a conclusion about, but it kind of, I'm trying to let it sit with me and dwell on it a little bit and let it, and maybe ruminate some, because it might not be the first thing one thinks about. Right. When, for example, Henry, when you were talking about these different forms of organizations of power, or how to elude the old forms, or get out of the dominant powers that be, there is an element in which this something spiritual has a role, and I don't necessarily think it has to be some sort of either parodic new age spiritualism or some sort of I don't think they mean it pejoratively, right? And so I think we have to treat that word or that gesture that they're making very. We have to take it seriously, and we also, I think, have to let it perhaps inflect and guide some of our reading. So I hadn't noticed it before, but it really stood out to me, and maybe I'm making too much out of it. But
yeah, no, I mean, I think the two things. I don't know what you think about this, guys, but there's I mean, one is difference of repetition. You have the opposition between bare repetition and spiritual repetition, which is the reference to the intensive, but also just like Carlos Castaneda's like really big, right? All of this sort of all of that kind of taking lots of peyote and doing spiritual exercises. Like that's, I mean, I guess that comes from Guattari, but it's really, really big throughout the text. And I think, like you're right, you can't go back to sort of these sort of primitive shamanic traditions, but in many ways they see someone like Henry Miller as sort of doing something similar, reintroducing something, or breaking through to something that's like lost within faciality. And also, like I say, the painters, like even in these kind of like little, painters can't help but to disrupt those, the kind of the face of Christ by turning into something else, by kind of incorporating variation into it and making it something that it wasn't. So I think spiritual is kind of, I mean, obviously you're right, you have to caveat it. It's not like new age spirituality, but I don't think it's out of place here at all. I think it's something that is quite hard to get the tone right of it without making it sound like kitsch, or without making it sound too dry and taking the meaning out of it. But yeah, I think it's something, like I say, I think I love life, not like you say, I think it's something that it's worth sort of letting sit with you to try and, as you're reading through, see what happens if you kind of make that word important. I guess that's interesting.
Three things I would say is, one, I brought this up where it seems to hearken to the virtual, and so it would, obviously that resonates with the emphasis on becomings animal or strange becomings, like becomings imperceptible, which is the whole point of Prohead and getting out of the face, right? The other thing would be, it seems to resonate with resonates with the virtual. What was the second thing? I'll have to come back to the second thing. The third thing, you brought up art earlier. You brought up Chrétien de Troyes, and obviously they spend a little bit of time, a few pages, talking about Proust with the diagrams, and they're talking about cinema all throughout, and the painters, right? Giotto and these others. At the bottom of 187, this has a spiritual tinge to it, especially with the way that they italicize the prepositions here. I'll try to capture it, but they say, "For it is through writing that you become animal." And this is the interesting thing, right? For Deleuze, one does not literally become an animal, right? You're not, but perhaps through literature, perhaps literarily, there is a becoming animal that can be undertaken. So it's through writing that you become animal. It's through color that you become imperceptible. It is through music that you become hard and memoryless, simultaneously animal and imperceptible in love. But art is never an end in itself. It is only a tool for blazing lifelines. In other words, all of those real becomings that are not produced only in art, and all those active escapes do not consist in fleeing into art, taking refuge in art, and all of those positive deterritorializations that never re-territorialize on art, but instead sweep it away with them toward the realms of the asignifying, asubjective, and faceless. So, all of this discussion of music, landscapity, painting, cinema throughout this plateau kind of culminates in I feel like in one of, and this is one of the moments, it culminates in this question about art, and as we know in Anti-Oedipus, art is all throughout that book, and they want to give it a specific role. They think about it as one of the machines. They want to make the art machine and the revolutionary machine and the analytic machine sort of all cogs working together towards this schizoanalytic goal. And so I think that's another aspect of the role of art in A Thousand Plateaus, or in capitalism schizophrenia as a whole. I think is not again, like we said earlier about metaphysics, I don't think it's by any means divorced from the political question that you were discussing.
Yeah, absolutely. There's like I think if you start the other way around with I really like the Chrétien de Troyes stuff, because you have this model in of drama in, say, Aristotle, where there's like an action, and then drama is just like the kind of expression of something in time that pre-exists that time. So something happens, or like a law is transgressed, and then you just have the time of the play is just the time of the unfolding of an action. And what they're interested in, really, I think, is the way in which like art just doesn't do that, and it kind of opens up something really different. And I've got like a quote from the lecture, some of the Deleuze seminars, where he's talking about Chrétien de Troyes, and rather than this notion that everything is organized by action, so everything is operating in a sedentary distribution, and time is just the expression, the way in which, that action is expressed in the world. He talks about the search for the Holy Grail, and he says the search for the Holy Grail is wonderful. They don't know what they're looking for. They don't know their own names. They pass the time forgetting their name. Molly is nothing in comparison to Lancelot. He's really incredible. In one of Chrétien de Troyes' finest romances, there's a knight who sees a cart. The story is called The Knight of the Cart. He looks at it and gets onto it. He doesn't have any reason for doing so. So you have this kind of model where, rather than like actions taking place in time, there's just like this stuff happening. It's like just time becomes primary, because like these things are happening for no purpose, and nothing's being expressed, and all of that structure falls away. And what happens there? Well, it's a stretch to compare that to, say, Virginia Woolf's The Waves, but in both, what happens is like temporality itself becomes articulated in the work of art. And in that happening, then these sedentary structures, which say that like determination and order is an atemporal moment that's simply as expressed in time, that gives form to time, they fall away, and you see time articulating itself. And I think that then opens up the possibility of a new way of seeing, and a new way of organizing, and there's a revolutionary act at the heart of arts, provided, as they say, it doesn't just stay within the world of art, but kind of opens out into the world. And it is that moment of recognizing articulation taking place in time and new connections being forged, rather than seeing structure as pre-existing and just being expressed, and time just being the time it takes for that structure to unfold itself. So
in this plateau, they give these illusions, or they imply the novel's distinctness versus the epic or the myth, right? And I know it's not directly here in terms of time, but it made me think about the way that Bakhtin runs through and develops his concept of the chronotope in order to classify different genres of literature, right? The move from sort of epic time to the time of the novel and everything in between. For him, the chronotope, right? This organization of space and place and time is sort of at the very heart of the genesis of these different genres throughout sort of the history of literature. And so I think that what you said makes very much sense. And I guess that it also harkens forward to the very next plateau about three novellas, what happened, right? Like this question of time becomes central in the subdivisions of these literary genres, and so I think that's very prescient.
Yeah, absolutely. Although, yeah, I don't. Yeah, I'll have to look at that Bakhtin stuff. That sounds really cool.
I would suggest, and I can always send it to you. I think it's called The Dialogical Imagination. That's where you'll find his. Let me see. I can give you exactly. Here it is. So yeah, The Dialogical Imagination, 4 essays, and so you'll get epic and novel is where it starts. So it kind of bridges the gap, but the big essay, the one that's could be a book length. It's almost 200 pages. It's called Forms of Time and Chronotope in the Novel. And so, like, yeah, 200 pages. I remember taking notes on that monster, but very much he goes from this sort of epic sprawling time where to something like the way that Deleuze and Guattari work through the syncopes, the sort of catatonic night, right, falling asleep on his steed. There's an element of temporality at stake in the in betweens of the action. So the notion of the chronotope would be really helpful if that's something of interest to you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Taylor. That's great.
I guess the last thing would be, we always want to give our guests the last word, and so please, Henry, if you'd like, you can tell us maybe a little bit more about the book that you are submitting to Edinburgh University Press in August. You can maybe tell us if you have a working title. You can tell us maybe a little bit more about that project, and if you've got any other projects that you've either begun or have only formed, incipiently, just tell us about those as well.
Yeah, thanks, Taylor. I mean, I have to admit, I just want to get this book done. then I'm gonna think about other projects. So I mean, I am kind of thinking about other things, but it's all quite loose at the moment, and I think I'm going to take. I kind of feel like I need to take a year to read stuff that's not in the bibliography of the footnotes to A Thousand Plateaus.
Yeah.
Like I've read lots of stuff, and lots of it's been real revelation. Some of it's not been.
Yeah, right.
So it's called Reading A Thousand Plateaus: Adventures in Nomad Thought.
Okay, I like that.
So that's the title, and yeah, I mean it really is just like a sort of prolonged study of A Thousand Plateaus, and I mean it is going to be quite long. So hopefully it's got. I think it's been nice to go into more detail than maybe many other people have been able to, just because I've got the space to do it for this project. But that's obviously been difficult too. But it's been really fascinating having to, when you're working through a book and you're trying to cover most of it, almost all of it, having to work out what's going on every page and make sense of it has been really wonderful and really bewildering at points, frustrating. But yeah, no. So hopefully it'll be out sort of middle of next year. It will be finished because it's I'm about 8,000 words from the end of it, 8,000 words of introductory material from the end of it. So yeah, I think it'll be a worthwhile piece of work. I think it does some work at points.
Now, is it going to look anything like the reader's guide you did, I believe, also for EUP on difference and repetition, or is it going to be substantially different in form?
Well, no, it's actually quite similar. I've kept the idea of breaking the text up into plateaus and then subsections, so kind of numbered, so 7.1, 7.2, etc. As I kind of break it down. And then one thing I've done it more is kind of reference back and forth, because I think it's a lot less linear a text.
Yeah,
so I've tried to use that to kind of make connections within it. But also, I think for a text like this, I've done a very similar thing where I've really tried to keep footnotes to a minimum.
Yeah.
So there's lots and lots of text, lots of references, in the text. And when I want to talk about secondary authors who are doing similar work, I mean, I have to admit, I put secondary text to one side while I was writing it, and now I've kind of finished. I've spent the last couple of months really reading whatever I can on A Thousand Plateaus. So that stuff's coming in afterwards in the footnotes. So the footnotes kind of deal with sort of surrounding literature. The text deals with A Thousand Plateaus and the sources of A Thousand Plateaus, addresses, and the Deleuze seminars and all of that stuff. So in many ways, it's quite similar to the difference in repetition guide. It's just a lot longer.
There you go. How many words do you know if you add the 8,000 you're crafting now?
Well, I mean, don't tell Carol MacDonald at Edinburgh University Press, but
I won't.
It's looking to be about 235,000 words.
Okay, so we're thinking that's probably 400 to 500 pages. Was that?
Let's have a look. So I've got my little. So the yeah.
It's probably about at least 400 pages, right? So
Yeah, I mean, depending on
and depending on typography and other things, yeah. So well,
so yeah, I mean, it's been like a really big project, and I've learned loads, but I'm also looking forward to
something new, right? Something different.
Absolutely.
Now for something completely different. Yeah. That's no that's good. I do appreciate that there is a lot of literature on A Thousand Plateaus, but to have one source that could be expansive and a deep dive throughout, that's much rarer. And I think that's why I mentioned the edited volume you did. That at least attempts something where for each plateau there can at least be another springboard to make sure that you're catching at least some of the bigger picture. But I assume with a work like yours, you're also going to be able to see some of the smaller details, and being able to like zoom in and out and across is that does make your project unique. And so I look forward to seeing it and its fruition. So because you've been working on, I know you already had some of this done the last time we had talked to you, right? I mean, so this has been obviously you put a lot of time into this. And so I think that definitely gives me a good indicator that it's going to be a banger.
I think it's good. I mean, it's it's not going to be the last word. I mean, I hope there'll be like more books than A Thousand Plateaus, but I think it's kind of nice to go through and at least give some kind of coherence to the whole text from a sustained argumentative point of view. And I think there are other ways you could do it. You could take other lines through it, and you could do the book would look quite different. If you were coming from a different background from the one I come from. But I think I've kind of found a way of holding it all together, which I think is something I'm quite happy with. I'm quite pleased with, given there's so much stuff there to tie together. So yeah, I think it's going to be good. And you're right, it's been a few years. I mean, I don't even want to think about
how many hours you put in.
How much of my life I've spent doing this.
1,000 hours with 1,000 plateaus. I probably more, right? So, I mean, the other thing I would say would be, and this will be the last thing, so I can give you the last word. The other thing I would say is, I was thinking about how when Deleuze is asked how to classify 1,000 plateaus, I think this interview is probably in Two Regimes of Madness. He says philosophy, right? Mm-hmm. It's philosophy, pure and simple. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that's all the book is about, but how to classify it in terms of its genres, because of the material. Obviously, the disciplines. This is kind of ground zero for interdisciplinary, studies or whatever, transdisciplinarity. But for Deleuze, he sees it as a book of philosophy. So to come at it from your background of obviously philosophy is a viable, not the only way to approach it, but seems to accord with Deleuze's own way of wanting to think of the book as being a book in the history of philosophy, or part of it, resonating with it, right? And obviously complexifying it too, because and that's how Deleuze has always used the history of philosophy, right? In a way that sees it as moments of creation, right? So I think that's part of what the book inspires, right? It is also a very creative book in its concepts, in its concept creation, and in its possibilities for thinking.
Yeah, and I think I've tried to recognize, I think the philosophy side is really important, but at the same time, it's a war machine, right? It's there to quite explicitly to operate by opening up a counter signifying process that sort of destabilizes so the regimes of science that philosophy also has written in. But that itself is a philosophical enterprise that's gone right back to the beginning of philosophy. But there's quite a radicality in the way that they do that in this text. So yeah, I think as a philosophical text, what's interesting is that it's a philosophical text that's there to kind of open up new ways of thinking in a way that's very, very different from many of the other texts we would see as philosophical texts. But at the heart still, are these engagements with Bergson and Spinoza and Kant and other people, even if they're kind of like doubled up against, Miller and Labov and Chomsky and these other figures. So, I mean, it's a very complex interweaving, I think.
Well, once the book comes out, maybe Coop and I will be done with our walkthrough of A Thousand Plateaus. As we said, we did something atemporal and nonlinear. We did plateaus 1 through 5. Had to skip 6, and we'll come back to it. So we'll jump from 5 to 7 and go back to 6. And I think that's not even a bad idea for those reading the book, even for the first time. Feel free to skip around and skim around and come back. You don't have to read it cover to cover. Sure, that might be the advisable thing, but they do themselves say, right, that it can be read in any order. They just strongly suggest leaving the conclusion, the 15th, for last, which kind of becomes apparent once you dive into that final plateau. So yeah, I think it'll be fine, us going back to the 6th plateau, I appreciate you jumping in, and I'm glad that you were here, because when Coop and I did the 10 episodes on Anti-Oedipus, we had several guests, at least 4 if I'm remembering off the top of my head, and so you're the first to jump in A Thousand Plateaus. So we may or may not have more join us to do some close readings of it. So you may be the singularity in our matrix.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and we can compare notes when when you get to the end of your project and when it gets to the end of mine.
yeah, it'll be a good companion once because having your book out, and I know people still talk. A few people still talk about the Anti-Oedipus playlist we have, for getting into it. Obviously non-exhaustive, but it's like trying to give guardrails, trying to give indications. This is self-promotion, but I do have to send you the translation I just completed with a friend of mine, Connor O'Day. We just translated Anne Sauvignard's book on transcendental empiricism. I'll have to send you a PDF before it comes out next year from Edinburgh University Press.
Oh yeah, do, that'd be great. I read that a long time ago in the French, but it'd be easier.
A little bit easier. Yeah.
To read it in the English.
Henry, I do want to thank you for joining us so late in the evening for you, and really enjoyed our conversation. We'll definitely have you on again in the upcoming year.
Oh, thanks guys. No, I really appreciate it. It's been really fantastic talking to you both again. I really enjoyed it. All right. Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.
And that'll wrap up another edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Chair and Taylor Atkins. We'll see y'all next week.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, pure violence without option. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.